My name is Darcy Staniforth Anderson. I'm an academic advisor, a program coordinator, and a lecturer in the field of American Studies. But before I became all of those things, I began as a low-income, first-generation college student who became an adult returning transfer student. I had to figure out how to navigate college through trial and error. But I was also a college student that experienced death and deep grief during my academic journey. You see, I did college a few times. The first time being right out of high school and attending a local community college. And while I was there, I was a good student. I was involved in theater, a member of the rowing team, and a member of the speech and debate team. But during that time, my grandmother was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. And while she lived with it for 2 years, she died during the winter break between the fall of '97 and the spring of '98. I didn't really know what to do with my grief, and it's part of the reason I took time off of school after community college to try and figure things out. Then, right as my return to school as an adult began in 2011, my father was diagnosed with COPD and ILD, 2 different lung diseases. He died over the summer of 2013, right after my second year back in school. Then, towards the end of my master's degree in 2017, I experienced a miscarriage, and I lost the child I was so hoping to bring into the world. But these were only the family deaths I experienced during my time in school. I also experienced the deaths of friends and people that I greatly admired as well. You see, as a student, I was kind of lucky that my grandma died over winter break and my dad died over summer, so I didn't have to worry about asking for time off from classes or end up delaying my graduation. And I know for some of you, that might give you a little bit of pause or make you feel kind of uncomfortable that I was even thinking about those things when I should have been focused on these deaths and losses and tending to my grief. But these messages about lost class time and delayed graduation were not something I made up. These messages came from my institutions of higher learning. But then there were also the messages I wasn't getting. I had never seen a bereavement policy in any of my syllabi. I didn't know how to address a death with one of my professors. I didn't know if my campus had a bereavement policy and where to go if I needed resources around therapy, counseling, or additional support. I may have had a lot of resources in my academic journey, but in my grief journey, I was alone. In my field of American studies, we study American history and culture. And I study death, dying, and grief in American culture. And one of the things that I can tell you is that we don't really like to talk about death in America. We even have a hard time saying somebody died. We say that they passed away, that they're at peace now, that they have eternal rest. And so if we're not talking about death, it means we're also not talking about grief. You see, in American culture, we have a death avoidant and grief avoidant culture. And because our colleges and universities are reflections of our larger culture, it means we're not really talking about death and grief there either, thus creating death avoidant and grief avoidant institutions. According to the article Advocating for Bereavement Leave Policies for College Students, 37 to 44% of college students say they have experienced the death of someone important to them while in college. And in my personal and professional experience, I have found this to be true. I have met with students who have lost babies, friends, family, parents, and relatives who were like their parents. I've sat with students who survived mass shootings when others have not, who have survived acts of terrorism, who have been the victims and survivors of violent crime, and those who have come away from war when their family and friends have not. And when I have asked them If they let their professors or advisors know what was going on ahead of time, they usually tell me no. But this doesn't surprise me. You see, as a first generation college student, it never occurred to me to let my professors know what was going on ahead of time. I was only worried about when something happened because this idea of compartmentalization had been drilled into me. School is school, work is work. Keep the personal at home. But for some, these are all the same space. A few years ago, we lost a student from one of our programs, and it was right before the semester started. His friend and roommate were also a part of our program, and they were in deep grief and shock. But they were expected to start the semester like any other student, as if in a few weeks, their grief would be done and they would just be able to go back to keeping school at school and the personal at home. But for them, the personal had happened at school because school was their home. And for those others where these may not be the same spaces, we still need to combat that idea of compartmentalization of school is school, work is work, keep the personal at home, because there is only one us, and our grief seeps into everything that we do. And for some students, the grief may not manifest until much later, well after the death occurs. I advised a student who lost his father in a horrible accident. And this student was the one who found and discovered his father. But in the semester when the death occurred, he had over a 3.0 GPA. It was the semester after that his grades tanked, because once it had gotten quiet and the shock had worn off, that's when his grief started to manifest. And he started to experience some of the changes that grief can bring. Changes in sleep, loss of meaning and purpose, changes in memory and the ability to remember, changes in social and family dynamics. And then he experienced conflict with those around him who did not know how to carry or walk with him in his grief. And we may also not consider the other ways in which a death could impact a student. They may not just have lost somebody they love or that was important to them, but they may have also lost the once stable life they had in regards to finances, housing, and food. At my work as a staff, I know what my bereavement policy is. I am entitled to 5 days of bereavement leave with pay for the death of each immediate family member or significantly close relative. At my work, I have to tell one person and I have to submit it to HR. But what about our students and bereavement? Our syllabi are very clear on our absence policies, but they don't say anything about bereavement. So if a student is even comfortable sharing with a faculty member that they have lost somebody, they have to ask each faculty member for extra time if that time falls outside of the regular absence policy. And the granting of that extra time is at faculty discretion. I have met with students who have been granted the extra time. I've met with other students who have been granted a very tight extended time. And I've met with other students who have been denied the time. Hear that again. A student told a professor that someone important died and they were denied the extra time. And if a campus does have a bereavement policy, it's really just related to immediate family members only. I mean, most bereavement policies are that way. But what if the person our student loses falls outside of that definition? This is where we need to consider those who don't have family privilege. You see, family privilege is defined by John R. Sita as the benefits, mostly invisible, that come from membership in a stable family. And so if our bereavement policies don't take into account students without family privilege, we have to ask ourselves, where does this leave our foster youth, our emancipated and independent students, Our students who have been disowned based on faith, gender, sexuality, or other identities. And then we don't really think about religion in this either. My university grants religious holidays off without penalty, but it does not say anything about cultural or religious observance after death. And so for some students in traditions like Judaism, they may sit Shiva for 7 days. But in Islam, the mourning period is 40 days. And then what if we're dealing with something like disenfranchised grief? Disenfranchised grief is defined by Dr. Kenneth J. Doka as the grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. This definition could apply to friends, roommates, boyfriends, girlfriends, mentors, professors, faculty, people the students really admire, and even their pets. And so if we're dealing with disenfranchised grief, where does this leave these students? Because we tend in our culture to have very set rules about who we are meant to grieve and who we are not meant to grieve. And we tend to be very dismissive of the losses younger people experience, especially if they are not tied to family, as if somehow us being older and having different relationships means that our losses are more meaningful than theirs. So how do we help? Author and psychologist Megan Devine writes in regards to grief, we see it as something to overcome, something to fix, instead of tend or support. And she goes on to say that if we move this from an idea of fixing to tending, then we give people the very thing we would want for ourselves: compassion, kindness, validation, and a way through the pain. As educators, and we are all educators, we need to commit to learning how to talk about death and grief and not dismiss it or sidestep it or avoid it. And for some of us, that might mean we need to learn to talk about death and grief in our own lives first. We need to learn about the biases, misconceptions, and misinformation we have about death and grief in our lives and in our culture. Learn the proper language around death and grief so we avoid doing violence to an already painful and difficult situation. We need empathy training that allows us to be present with our students and not dismiss or bright side what they are going through, and allows us to respond with compassion and helpful resources. We have to create spaces, both in the classroom and in our offices, that allow students to feel comfortable in sharing about death or grief. Fellow educators, you have definitely had someone in your space that has not felt comfortable sharing with you that they have experienced a death or a loss. And it is so important to examine why. And if we are going to make suggestions around things like therapy and counseling, support groups and grief groups, we need to do so without any stigma around mental health or its resources. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, but Darcy, I am not a grief counselor. I mean, isn't that why we have counseling and psychological services on our campuses? Don't our students just go to them for help in their grief journey? In a word, no. As a lecturer and advisor, I've had students come to me because they're starting to have trouble in their classes. And they see this trouble after a death as an academic problem, when really the problem is that their grief is beginning to manifest. And finally, we have to advocate for bereavement policies on our campuses and in our syllabi. and avoid doing violence to our students through asking for proof. It was winter break when my grandmother died. And it was summer break when my father died. But in 2017, when I experienced my miscarriage, I was at school. I left campus early that day, and I spent the night in the ER. But then I returned the next week empty of child and full of grief and sorrow. But I came back because it was the end of the semester and I had a very large paper due. And while the adult in me knew that this would be a very valid reason to ask for an extension on my paper, the first generation college student in me was still so nervous to do so. But I went to my professor's office hours and I explained to her what happened. She sat with me and listened. She asked me how I was doing and what I needed. She did not try and dismiss or brightside what I was going through. She was present and she met me with the kindness and compassion I so needed in that moment. By learning to better serve our students in their death and grief journeys, we begin to change our culture from one of avoidance to one of education and compassion. We let our students know that they are not alone on their grief journeys, but that there are others to walk with them. Because as the late Ram Dass said, we're all just walking each other home. So let us learn to be better companions on that walk.